Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Hello, Andy.
Oh, hey. Good morning.
It's good to see you. Welcome back from the 2-week hiatus. That was my caused 2-week hiatus.
Oh, I know. Yeah, believe me.
I was feeling a bit overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're normally whelmed and
Yeah, and then I got an
overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, that's okay. I mean, not that you're overwhelmed. That we took a hiatus.
Yeah. Have you ever? Well, I don't know how. When you guys preach, how many weeks in a row you preach?
Oh yeah, it varies.
But 3 is my max.
Okay.
And so I start getting the second one. I'm like, because it's not the end, and I'm gonna hand things off. I get a little bit more overwhelmed as to what I'm preparing, and then this is my 3rd week this week. But I just am not. 3 is my max.
Leading up into our merger, I had preached every service for 3 years except for 1.
Okay, so you're a master.
No, I'm saying this is pre-merger.
Pre-merger.
This is, yeah, so that was, but here's the thing. I was used to it. I was in rhythm. So I would say I can do it a lot if it's patterned into my week and it's what I'm used to.
Yeah.
When there was a point where it was Nick, John, and I at Mission, and I was in a pattern of doing it less often, and then now I'm doing it more often, so I had to readjust. But once I adjust and I kind of get my rhythm down for whatever it is, that seems to be the key.
Yeah. Well, and I think what I've realized is the way I structure my week with people and things, 1 or 2 weeks is fine, but it begins to have it all. I'm working too many hours usually, and it's becoming more and more. I'm spending more time, than I should be. Yeah, because of the extra hours.
Yeah. Well, hey.
So anyway,
no worries, man. I think everybody out there is probably suffering because they missed 1 week of Faith Over Breakfast.
They are,
and we're sorry.
But we're going to give them, at least we think, we're going to give them a one that will maybe have them on the edge of their seat.
Oh, there you go. So, well, I mean, it's in the news. Protests, pro-Palestinian protests. That's
all over college campuses.
So that seems to be, to my surprise, getting a lot more space than the abortion conversation right now. At least.
A lot more space.
A lot more space, which is somewhat of a surprise to me. There's a lot of, but right before we started talking, I said this conversation is fraught with peril, right?
Yeah, fraught with peril.
There's a lot at stake. There are groups out there that are very clear on their stance. There are very prominent groups that are very much avoiding a stance because it's really complex.
Right.
Yeah.
So sort of the and there's truth to it, but sort of the caricature of it, from the river to the sea, or whatever that phrase is. There's the more extremists that kind of is a stream that's underneath the protests that you'll see those up here, especially they're like the news. What do you call it? The way to clickbait, so to speak, people into reading about the protests is you're going to put the extreme stuff forward. But it seems to me that, and no matter where you stand, the general protest is college students saying, hey, we think that this war has gone on too far. Too many Palestinians have been killed. There doesn't seem to be any kind of end in sight. And we would like our communities, schools, to divest themselves of connection with Israel, because Israel isn't moving towards a ceasefire and moving towards, in their mind, a stopping of the war. Right, that's kind of the basic idea. So they're asking for the the government, but more to the state schools to take steps to deal with things. And so some schools have gone towards compromises and they've been able to disperse these protests by offering audiences with the investment trustees, or agreeing to divest certain things, or giving more voice in different sections of the school, while others have brought in the police and removed them forcibly. And you can add to that, but that's kind of my understanding at this point of how the protests have been dealt with. And
well, I don't have an expert angle on explaining the protests. I think I have more curiosity than answers. One of the things I was thinking about was the difficulty in assessing this stuff is that, number one, there's not like an organization running these. There's not a complete uniformity. So even when you think about the various campuses, there are various dynamics and cultural dynamics, and people who are sort of, somebody always takes the lead, or some people take the lead in any kind of grassroots movement like this. And every one of these campuses or every location is going to have a slightly different flavor depending on who takes the lead. And then when there's not a really cohesive and unified vision as to what's going on, there's going to be the amalgamation of who shows up and what they end up doing and saying is going to be unique as well. So you're going to get your more extreme people start to show up at some point. You're going to have maybe even divisions within that movement at some point are going to arise as people go, well, I'm not comfortable going that far, or you're not going far enough.
Right.
And so I assume from what I'm seeing that there's all of that is developing. I also have a ton of questions. I think I've been thinking a lot about kind of the meaning crisis idea, and like how much is this, originally coming from a place of needing something to care about deeply.
Right.
And I'm not saying that there aren't like a lot of very sincere people and that those folks aren't doing a lot of kind of educating of themselves, but I have encountered some people in my circles where I've thought, I don't know if you are really invested in this. Really, I feel like you're going to move on to another thing very, very soon. And it feels like there's a lot of that right now. And I wonder how much that is of just like grasping for something that is significant that I need to be a part of to feel alive and as if I have meaning. And I wonder if that's being examined. The other thing I was thinking about was obviously another era I know squat about because I wasn't alive, but the 60s and the general tenor of like protests during the 60s as opposed to protests now. And then, of course, the 60s and 70s gave birth to the 80s, where you have a very different, you've kind of got the moral majority and all that. And so there are these pendulum swings that societies do. And I sort of see that within our society now as people are watching these movements. There's this other side, and even people within the movements who will start to doubt the movements. Like a lot of today's conservatives or former hippies. And you go, I wonder what the future holds as people look for meaning in this and then eventually reflect, and what will that mean? And a lot of that feels very disconnected from what's actually going on in Israel and Palestine, which is just absolutely beyond my grasp as to how devastating it is. And it's a strange thing to do from the place of being in a country across the world right now, to assess it and assess your neighbor's view of it when most of us are very disconnected from it, especially since we only engage it via social media. Like our sense of solidarity with it is because of these social media platforms that we say we do not trust most of the time. And that's an interesting thing. So anyway, to me, there's this web of complexity. I have more questions than answers. Right. So Eric, back to you
bring it all home.
To bring it all home.
Well, I think there's a couple things that I would like to talk about. One, I would say probably about 10 years ago. Man, not 10 years ago. Was it 10? Let's say 7. 7 years ago, we had a guy in our church who spent time on the border in Palestine, and he was part of a nonprofit organization that was doing, kind of trying to work through relationships between Jews and Palestinians. He also had written a bunch of he had translated psalms into music, and sung them in Hebrew, and they were beautiful. But anyway, what he talked a lot about was his concern about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and what that meant over the next 7 to 10 years for Jewish people. And it's been documented. The anti-Semitism has risen at kind of rocket levels over the last 10 years.
And I should say, not to argue, I'm not arguing that, actually. I know that's going on. I was reading something recently about the complexity of, I keep using the word complexity, but the people don't know in kind of the pluralist framework what to do with Islam either.
Sure.
And so they're in countries like the Netherlands, where a lot of Islamic immigrants have come and have set up community, and they're going, okay, we're going to be truly Islamic. Countries like that were saying, hey, we're going to do total pluralism, are also starting to realize some of our values are not compatible, and there's a new kind of angst against Islam rising in some places that were going to be very pluralistic.
Right. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Yeah. I think it's just, American anti-Semitism has been on the rise in a more pluralistic place. I would just say that, yes, I think Islamic, that's true. I just think that historically we find that the Jewish people get themselves.
There's a clear and horrendous history.
So we come to this moment where there's this attack on Israel, and it's hard to understand it, but the best way to understand what happened is as if Mexico attacked the capital of Texas, and just they parachuted into Dallas, or wherever the capital is. Actually, not Dallas is the capital. It's San Antonio, the capital. What's the capital of Texas? I don't know. I just think there's a lot of
it's not San Antonio.
Austin. I don't know where it is. Yeah. Anyway, Houston. I don't know what it is. Anyway, they parachute in. And
that's hilarious.
And they butcher people, right?
Except you would have to load Texas with as much spiritual significance worldwide as Israel.
I understand that.
And the Middle East, yeah.
So we retaliate. And what it turns out that you realize after we retaliate is that a lot of, there's all these tensions on the border, and there's all this complexity, and there's all of this way that we as Americans are culpable in creating the suffering on the other side. All of a sudden you realize this. And now, but there's still this huge threat. We've got to deal with it. And so now we're all caught in this thing where people are dying on both sides of the border. To us, that's a little bit more, for me, it's that helps me understand. There's this unique complexity. There was a butchering that happened, and then once there's a retaliation, you begin to see that the narratives are big. It doesn't justify what happened in Israel, but it's this, we could ignore the problem for so long, or we could try to build a wall, or we could try to do all the things. And you start learning that there's all this governmental intrigue, and there's all of this money flowing back and forth, and there's power games being played. And you're like, oh, okay, this is way above my pay grade. Right.
Well, and if you lived in that area, you were well aware of this. But if you're a 20-something-year-old college student in America,
right,
you really get what's kind of heavy in your algorithm.
Right.
And so the discovery about all this is happening now. And then there's this especially unique American alliance with Israel that you have to then unpack as well. And right. I think, I was yes. curious with, this would be my other question is, and I think having to like kind of bring our Christian brothers and sisters into this, how much more complex in America is this due to the theological sense of connectivity to Israel that does not have the same level of connectivity toward Islam?
Yes.
And the variety of views on Israel that live within evangelicalism that create alliances or felt alliances between people that are hard to understand if you're not a part of that. So in a post-Christian world where like our college students didn't grow up with this baked in, I had a Christian neighbor who used to sit me down as a child and would tell me all about how Israel was going to be reestablished and how they'd been reestablished and how Jesus was going to return in Israel and what the signs of the second coming were. And I had to unravel that real hard at some point and go, you know what? That may not be right theologically. But it was so like baked in that my general assumption was Israel's good guys and they're all up in my Bible. And that definitely means whatever war is going on right now in current day, they're on the right side of it.
Right.
There are a lot of Christians who don't think that way, but there are a lot who do in America.
Right.
And in the churches that America has exported elsewhere. So if you're 20-something, though, in college, you didn't grow up with that baked in like me, you're just looking at this going, what? Like, why are we so allied? And some of the alliances have nothing, or, well, I don't know. There are politicians who might make political choices that are actually anchored in that background. Mm-hmm. But yeah, how much do you think that unique American theological tradition layer you grew up with some.
Oh, no.
How much do you think that impacts us right now, you and me, as we?
Because we're a little bit more reactionary to it. So,
but still, we grew up with it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, I usually ask two questions, and I sometimes have a hard time merging them together. Because one is, as a follower of Jesus in an empire,
right?
I feel very called to live 3 feet in front of me.
Yeah.
Right. Who's my neighbor?
Yeah.
And I understand the complexities of Rome. Jesus is not.
And by empire and Rome, you're talking about
the United States.
The empire we live in. Yes.
And everyone lives in empire.
Yes.
Those people in Palestine live in empire.
Yeah. I'm just clarifying that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so for me, there's like, I haven't even sorted out Ukraine yet, and we've moved on to Israel.
It's almost like it's over. It's not, by the way. Yeah.
It's not.
No.
And so the empire is at play in so many different places, either directly or indirectly, in the one that I live in. So I have to figure out what I'm supposed to what would Jesus do 3 feet in front of me? And if the Palestinian or the Ukrainian things enter 3 feet in front of me, how do I deal with them? Because of how much is going on, I can't be involved or in all of them.
Right? Well, and there's a real arrogance that we Westerners have. I'll just say this, that we know what these people need. Right. And that hit me one time when there were a number of African refugees from one of the wars a while back. And in some of our churches, we got those folks. And I remember I was in relationship with a guy from one country. There was another church where some friends of mine were, and they were in relationship with somebody from the same country. My assumption was they have the same experience. They view things the same.
No.
I learned they were actually enemies, though they were same country, same, in my mind, same experience.
Right.
They viewed each other's views and each other as suspect for very complex reasons that I very much misunderstood. And I will admit right here, I think I sided with the wrong one, or accidentally. Right. I made assumptions that were probably way wrong because I thought I got it.
Right.
I didn't get it. I didn't know anything about what happened in their country. I was reading news clips.
Right.
So
I think, yes. And that's so the complexity of it all is the important part. So for me, I think about how do I open my heart? Like, how's my heart open to the suffering narratives? Because that's where Jesus is going to be found. And there is a suffering narrative in the Palestinian people, and there is a suffering narrative in the Israelite people. And I am pro-Israel in the sense of it having land because of its suffering narrative. Now, what that looks like, I have no understanding of. But but there's a suffering narrative, and that's the thing where Jesus is going to be found. That's where my prayers are, and that may be where my action takes place. But I think, for me, I was thinking about Jesus somehow would find himself involved in these protests in college. He would also be sitting next to the Jewish kids who are feeling displaced and also being harassed. Right?
Yeah, on campus, feeling scared for their lives now.
Yeah, so there's this, Jesus stands between people and Jesus stands with people. And I think that the Gen Zers, that those are the ones in college and those are the ones protesting, do have a certain level of empathy.
Yeah.
And I think
I don't want to disparage some of what they're...
they move on empathy and not on wisdom, which is partly of youth.
Yeah.
But it's partly because they haven't been...
wisdom is not as popularized as either empathy or rage.
Yes. And so these two things. So that's my concern. I think Jesus would be pushing towards wisdom with the Palestinian protesters and softness with the kids who are just like Jewish kids who are not even part of this. Like, they're Jewish, but they are Americans. They're not even, many of them they don't plan to go back to Israel. They don't have a lot of connections to Israel. They're just practicing their faith here in the United States. So it's...
Well, it does seem that the whole pluralism project is being doubted.
Yeah.
That there's a skepticism toward the old tolerance bumper sticker.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if that was the thing that was, where people were looking at that and going, that's what it should be like. It should be all the faiths, just they respect each other, they get along. There seems to be a lot of skepticism in that idea now.
Yes, there is.
And what's on the other side of that skepticism? You either you go no faith at all. There's a lot of skepticism about that as well, by the way. Mm-hmm. That's so how do you stand for anything? Where do you find your grounds? Or you actually do pick one, and you take a side. Yeah. And that in our secular, I'm not talking about it within religion. I'm actually saying more in our secular society, the no tolerance. You pick one and you take a side, and you fight. Yeah. That seems to be actually the pendulum swinging that way, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I agree. And I think as a follower of Jesus, I usually try to sit in Jeremiah 29, where I want to pray for the peace of the city. Because if there's peace in the city or in the empire, so to speak, then there's peace for me and my family. Mm-hmm. And so there is an active, without ceasing intercession that I and followers of Jesus need to be part of as we look at all of these places of suffering. Because in those spaces, we will be called into action. I think the hard part for Christians is that we want to take a side. We want to make a judgment about who is right and who is wrong, or who has the most right and who has the most wrong, and then let's make a judgment and join that side. When Jesus really invites us to say to Palestinians, like, man, you have to repent. You butchered these people, got butchered.
Sure,
it's terrible.
Yeah,
and Israel, like, you can't just decide that you're going to wipe out Hamas and just kill a ton of innocent people because you need to keep yourself safe. There has to be another space. Like, killing people is not the solution.
Well, the incredible thing in the early Christian church is you started to see Jews and Romans, Pharisees, tax collectors, rulers and their slaves being invited to sit together as equals.
Right.
Under God. And that was a small movement because that's really hard to do. And then the interesting thing is the church, I think the Christian church needs to lead out of our failures here, even ancient ones, and say, that was the call of Jesus. And then we started to do the pick a side thing and the empire thing. And that wasn't following Jesus. And you can see how bad that went and how much that destroyed our own hearts and faith. And so, I mean, a thought that I just had was, what would a secular crusade look like? Like, I think that we're teetering on that discussion, like in our culture. Like, what would it look like to crusade against something as a from a secular point of view, without a religion at the but there's always religious. I'd say without a unified religious vision.
Sure.
But there's always a religious vision. Like if religion has to do with like what we think is most important, what we value the most.
Yeah.
But I think we as a culture need to think about, like, if we're swinging the direction of doubting that a true like unifying movement could happen where you sit between people and everyone has to repent and everyone's affirmed, which can only happen with a God at the core of it.
Right.
If you're not going that direction, you're going toward crusades. And what would it look like? I think Christians can only lead here by saying, we've done this wrong. You can read our story. Like, hear us as we beg you not to sin like we did. Because that could be real bad.
Right. Well, yeah, and I would argue that the crusade would be created by the religion of the neo-Freudian, neo-Marxist, neo-postmodern
yes
underpinnings of this is not new. I mean, Nazism and things out of Russia,
and those are crusades in their own right.
They're secular crusades, and I mean,
but there is a religion under them.
Yes, yeah. And I think that we have to be very careful. But I also think, as followers of Jesus, we follow what God's called to us to do, which is to call people to repentance, call people to Jesus. I always love, like, the social movement of the gospel is very simple, right? It's Galatians 3. It's no longer Jew or Gentile. Yeah. That's the first step of the social movement. Then neither free or slave. Yeah. Second part, neither male or female. And that's just simply there's an equality of there under Christ. They fit in the same seat of sonship. So that's the social thing, and you see that happening in the early church. Now, then we started reversing it backwards, and we became slaveholders, and we began to divide ourselves. And so I think the call of the gospel is always in the shadow of the cross, built towards this. There's no longer Jew or Gentile. We have to go back to that. That's back to phase one of the social project.
Now, that, I should say, if you're listening, we believe that for the church, which is, as we understand it, the gathering of people of all nations, all places, all times, under Jesus Christ as Lord. That's the call that we understand as Christians, with that framework, knowing who our God is, knowing who our Savior is, the incarnate Word in Jesus. So that's not the call of the United States of America, or that call. It is inappropriate for Benjamin Netanyahu to believe that his nation is the church, or the United States, or the Netherlands, or Britain, or anybody. Right?
No, I totally agree. Yeah.
And I think that has to be spelled out, because there's a conflating, and this is what people observe sometimes in Christianity, between the empire that we live in and the call of the church.
Yeah. I'm just going to, if you have never listened to Theology in the Raw with Preston Sprinkle, I would go and listen to a few of his podcasts, because what he does is he brings on Christian Palestinian scholars to talk about stuff. He brings on Christian Jewish scholars to talk about things, and it's really cool, because they talk about their fears, they talk about their anxieties, they talk about how they understand themselves as Christians first, and then their nationality second, and what that means and how it looks like, and it's really thought-provoking. And I think if you want,
I haven't listened to any of it. Yeah,
if you want to get into this and really hear a Christian perspective and hear people who are wrestling with it because they either live in Israel or live in Palestine or have lived there, it's really fascinating and helpful, because I think the church has to say it can look different.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to even be perfect. It can look different, and we can work this out together and try to heal the wounds and sorrows of one another.
Yeah. I've been curious about Promised Land, the podcast. I've listened to one episode, so I have no idea where it goes. I don't know where it lands. I don't know if I can recommend it.
I've never heard it.
But the premise of it seems to be doing a deep dive on the history and journey here. That's with Mike Cosper, who did the Mars Hill podcast that many people have listened to. So that's been one that I've been curious about. There's been a ton of ink spilled, and there's good books and there's not so good books, and there's all kinds of stuff out there. That's the trouble on this, is there's so much information out there and so many angles. But yeah, it's the vision you want to invest in, I would say, would be one that really asks that question of what does it look like for another primary identity to bind people together, since these national and empirical identities aren't working.
Right. And I think that in the church there are what I would call three kind of voices that are trying to wrestle with this. I mean, you have the Doug Wilsons who are really in the Christian nationalism, right? And then you have like Preston Sprinkle in the middle, who just came out with a book called Exiles in Babylon. And then there's David French and the Good Faith podcast, who tend to lean a little bit more to the left in their dealing with, and they're doing a whole bunch of political stuff right now and how to be political.
Well, if you asked them, I know that group better, they would be like, the left has no interest in us. The
left mocks them. I agree. Yeah. It's just they tend to lean more to what I would call old school liberalism. They're
more classical liberals. Some people would say Sprinkle is more left than them.
I don't know.
It's all about who you're talking to.
Yeah. Yes. I think Sprinkle is less adamant. That's why I put him in the middle, is he refuses to make statements like the other two sides are willing to.
Well, and David French is like, he's coming from a politics background, so he's going to talk politics more. He's not going to talk about gender identity as much as Sprinkle.
Right. Well,
because of his background.
And Sprinkle's Exiles of Babylon has nothing to do with gender, but
I'm saying his body of work.
Yeah, his body. Yeah, his body of work for sure is all gender oriented.
Yeah,
until this recent book, but yeah.
And then there's your, who would be like Shane Claiborne, Jim Wallace, Sojourners. This is in the Christian world that would be like.
Yeah,
normally people say that is left.
Yeah.
I don't know what right and left are anymore, by the way, because
I just mean, so how far separated are you from empire? I think that is kind of what I would argue.
But the hard thing is you could take Shane Claiborne, Shane Claiborne's from Philly, right? Yeah. Like he's very much like generally, pro-Palestinian right now, but I don't even think he would say that. He's more like, we need to be with the oppressed. Then you've got Doug Wilson on the other side, who you were just saying is a Christian nationalist. But I don't think either one of them would say, I'm with the empire. They just have very different theological visions.
Right.
About
one is to convert the empire.
Well, yeah, or to become the empire. I think Wilson's thing is like Christians should become the empire.
Right.
Claiborne's thing would be the Christianity is always like this movement that is outside of the empire until the return of Christ.
Yes.
Those subtleties matter.
Yeah.
And can lead you to very different decisions. And you can actually look through, if you're a Christian historian, which I'm not, but I've dabbled all over the place, you can go look at how the same conversation worked out in the Reformation, for example. You can look at Luther and Zwingli and Calvin.
Yes.
And you can look at the three different paths they took. Zwingli was probably more of your Doug Wilson.
Yes.
And guess what? He got killed.
Yeah.
And history looks back at that and says he was too empirical. That's why, and by the way, that hurt his theological vision, and the whole nation that followed him suffered because of it. But then you can look at the sins of the failures of Calvin and the failures of Luther and all the, these divisions aren't new. It's kind of old news.
Yeah, it is old
but
news.
There's a new version of it that's living out in front of our eyes.
Yeah, and I think that's the conversation that's influencing the Christian conversation, are those three kind of places.
And this stuff, by the way, has shaped the world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's not just interesting.
Yeah, no, it shapes the world, and it's shaping us and how we think and what we do. And so, yeah, I mean, I all that to say, I think we have to be very careful as followers of Jesus in standing up when we're saying the government is right in what it's doing, and we're not looking at the suffering that's happening and asking where Jesus is in the suffering and where we should be.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we as evangelical Christians would much rather be in the right, and I can put myself here, than with the suffering and seen as being wrong, with the wrong side.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because Jesus found himself most of the time with the wrong side.
He generally, I mean, we're in Mark, right?
Yeah.
And
well, you're in Mark, yes.
Sorry,
we're in John.
My church is in Mark. And it's, as you slow down and read that book, you go, he's not winning. Jesus is not, he's the empire thing, or even the anti-empire people, they're both real disappointed with him.
Yes.
He's kind of with the people. Mm-hmm. And the people are a mess.
Yes.
But that's where he's at.
Yeah. And I think that's key because Jesus, I mean, and I like John because John, one of my favorite things is John 2, in John 2 where John says about Jesus that he didn't entrust himself to the people because he knew all men.
Yeah. And there's that too, right?
And so like he understands.
He's with the people.
Who he's with, but he knows who he is. He doesn't need other people outside to look inside and say, oh, well, you're doing it wrong and you're the wrong person. This is who you are because of that. He's like, no, you don't get to tell me that. And I think that's a powerful thing. I think we're often looking for the right thing and for people to say we're in the right place. But if you're going to follow Jesus, you could probably find yourself in the wrong place and misunderstood as to why you're there.
Yeah.
And on either side, like because I think Jesus draws us to the suffering. And so even that is like who in all these spaces is suffering, and how do I come either pray or be with them or and stand up for them as best I can.
Yeah, well, and love with them, or compassion. That word means to suffer alongside.
Right. So suffer, yeah.
And that's the most challenging word to me. I mean, that's why the cross is called the Passion, because Jesus came and suffered amongst us. And that's what, we can talk all day and yap about the views and all the stuff. Mm-hmm. But the call to sit with someone in their suffering that's the challenging one.
Yes.
Yeah.
It really is.
And in their suffering, not like this is where I would push back on some of the protesters and stuff. It's like, it's one thing to, you can get behind somebody else's cause for very selfish reasons, trying to find meaning and purpose and so on.
Right.
That is not the same as entering into the complexity of other people's sufferings and the enemy's sufferings.
Right.
The one who you wish was wiped off the earth, if you can learn to be with them so what would it look like to be the pro-Palestinian protester who went and sat with the Jewish student at the lunch table, and said, I'm not against him, and then watch your people turn on you too.
Right.
You might start to taste the heart of Jesus.
Yeah. No, I think that's a beautiful way to end this. I think that just sums it all up.
There we go.
To where we're at least hopeful in what God's called us to.
Yeah. Well, cool. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And we appreciate you. You know that you can always send us your questions, faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com.
We got 2 so far this year, so that's good.
And we are cruising.
We any one of our lovely listeners who wants to quickly send us an email at faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com, we will answer it.
Well, we will. Yeah. And so, yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to us. We are beyond appreciative, and we just enjoy getting together and talking through something. Your presence at the table means the world. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Eric, and I am a pastor at the Village Church in Tucson, Arizona. And across from me is Andy Littleton, one of the pastors of Mission Church, also in Tucson, Arizona. We've been doing this podcast for a couple hundred episodes.
Something like that.
And it's been a long time. We used to meet up in EXO's little office space at the top loft there.
That's right. Yeah, EXO coffee shop. I just saw a post where it was a new post about great coffee shops or something, and it showed a picture of that space, which is no longer around.
Okay.
That back space is no longer open.
Okay.
It closed during COVID. And I don't know why this new article chose that picture, but I was just like, oh, I miss it back there. But so this is a good premise of our podcast moment here. So today here's the deal. We're going to talk the pro-Palestinian protests and various ways to think, especially as Christians, about the Israel-Palestine conflict. So great moment to say, so why do we do this? Well, Eric and I used to be on a radio show with a couple of people from our church, and we would have a breakfast beforehand where we would talk a little bit about what we were going to share on the show. And this topic very well could have been one of those. Easily.
Yeah.
Because it was about culture and such things. And so we would have the breakfast, and we would have this long form working it all out, and then we'd have to go on the radio, and we'd end up getting 5 minutes. Yeah. And it was near impossible to pull off a really thoughtful dialogue.
Right. You were trying to do sound bites, basically.
Sound bites.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that was over, we went, well, that was cool. I mean, that was fun, but we really liked the breakfast, and we decided to just turn the breakfast into a podcast. And the idea is, like those guys used to sit with us as we were working something out, we're inviting you to sit with us.
Yeah.
So today, that's what we're doing with this topic. This is the breakfast table conversation. This isn't scripted. This isn't the thing where we're saying this is our church's view, or even this is our view.
Right. And we mentioned people like Doug Wilson, Dr. Preston, and David French, and who was the other person you mentioned?
Shane
Claiborne. We are familiar with their positions, but we are not people who are representing their position.
No.
We may have misrepresented them. So
we hardly gave you anything on them, really.
So if you are interested in looking at what they have, just Google their names and you can take a deep dive into their space.
Yeah. So anyway, you need to know the premise of the show to take it in well. I think there's some really good stuff in here, but don't ever think that this is the position.
The position of Village or Mission.
Right.
So before we go, though, I do have a little pitch.
Yeah.
So I've been pondering things. I run 3 podcasts: Faith Over Breakfast, Healing the City, and now my mother and I have a podcast called Journey Companions.
And formerly Dudes, Foods, and Sports.
Yes, formerly. Yeah, we did a little end around. So some people who are sports people are like, wait, what happened to this channel? Got real serious, real deep, right? But here, what I realized is over those platforms, there's probably 150 to 200 individual listeners who listen. Mm-hmm. And what I realized is if each one of those people subscribe to any of those podcasts for $10 or $3 or $5, if we had that many subscribers, we could hire a producer, guest scheduler, and social media person easily.
Wow.
Because that would bring us close to, $1,500 a month.
There you go.
So if you're like, wow, I do enjoy these guys, and Eric spends about 3 hours putting up different podcasts and stuff and editing, loved someone else to do that, love to be part of the process, boom. Subscribe for $10. It's nowadays it's a Chipotle. Give up Chipotle one day out of 30,
and just take your little faith burrito that we wrap up for you.
Yeah, we wrap up a faith burrito for you, and so subscribe. Yeah. I'm not going to make this pitch a lot. I just want to put it out there. Here was a little thing I was thinking about this week. So
great.
Be really awesome. It's so easy to subscribe. Just click on the little thing that says subscribe in the show notes.
Boom. All right. Well, enjoy. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope that our conversation's helpful. I would encourage you to take it all in, the whole conversation.
Yep. Thank you. You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.